Good morning, Read 180 students. Today we are going to be working on lesson 4. It is Thursday, April 16th. So if you are watching this, you'll be noticing that we're going to continue with our workshop 3, Life in Dystopia. Today our learning target is going to be I can identify setting, character, plot, and theme in a story. We also know these as literary elements, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that, and then we were going to be reading the first part of the story, The Lottery. So you should have your booklet in front of you, and you can follow along in the slideshow or in your booklet. We're not going to be doing any writing in your booklets today. So you won't have to be responsible for anything on these pages until we really start looking at the story, okay? So in workshop 3, you're going to notice that at the very top where it says Making Meaning, the Lottery, we're going to be reading a little bit about the lottery in this lesson today, especially with the focus of literary elements, which is setting, character, plot, and theme. So if you follow along with me in the first slide, The Lottery is a short story. And a short story is a brief work of fiction. Now remember, fiction is made up. Generally, the short story focuses on one or two main characters and a single problem or conflict. So like other works of fiction, short stories will contain these 4 elements. Now, I'll go through the slide, but on the right-hand side, I have just also just kind of a reference for you. So if you look at setting, it's where and when the story takes place. In The Lottery, this story, it takes place on a summer morning in the village square of a small town. Characters are the people in the story who it's mostly about. Okay, so when you look at the lottery, the focus is going to be on the town people, or the townspeople, sorry. Their words, thoughts, and actions are going to help move those events forward, and that moves into the plot. And the plot is just the sequence of events. It also contains a conflict or a problem. Usually when you think of a sequence of events, you think of a story being the beginning, middle, and the end. Now in the lottery itself is the conflict that the characters are going to face. Now, if you look at the number 4, theme is the important message about life or the meaning that the author wants you to understand. Now, if you look, one theme, you'll notice as we move through, some stories will have more than one theme. One of the themes in the lottery is that following a tradition without considering those consequences can be dangerous. And we're going to really try to help understand that theme better by analyzing kind of what the characters say and do and their action as they go through this sequence of events. So again, when you think of literary elements, you just think of it as parts of the story. And those are the 4 that we're just got done talking about: setting, characters, plot, and theme. Now, I know most of us know what a lottery is, but the definition you'll notice is it's a drawing of lots which prizes are distributed to the winner. It can also be an event in which what happens is decided by luck or chance. So to think of you've heard of people buying lottery tickets, trying to win that big pot of money in the Minnesota lottery. At Franklin Middle School, we have Pride ticket drawings, and I know some of you, again, will kind of take all of your tickets and put them in at opportune times so you can have a better chance, or that your luck is better at getting that prize that you have your eye on. Now, what we're going to do today is we're going to actually read the story, The Lottery. It is a short story written by Shirley Jackson. And it's about a sleepy town that is not quite what it seems. Okay, so I want you to keep that kind of in the back burner. And today we're going to read together pages 134 to 137. I want you to follow along as I read aloud. Okay? Before we start though, and if you have to pause this, go ahead and do that. But I want you to take a minute to look at the text features on these next 4 pages. Remember, text features include the title, could be bolded words, could be pictures, and footnotes. And remember, footnotes are located at the bottom of the page. It helps with some kind of sometimes vocabulary that is not familiar to us. And I will also be stopping along as we read through this. Now, again, as we read this story together, we're going to be working together to notice how these literary elements help us to understand the story, the lottery, a little bit better. So before we do any worksheets or talking about the literary elements, we're going to read just the first part of the story so we can start focusing on those elements and maybe focusing and getting a handle of what's happening in this first part of the story. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start reading. You should be on page 134, and you'll notice it says The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. Again, you can see at the bottom, we do have a couple of footnotes. On page 134, we see the word profusely, and that means it's like a large amount. It's abundant. On page 135, we have footnotes. Assembled, where people are assembled or together as a group. I think of an assembly. Boisterous, they're really kind of noisy, they're rowdy. And exchanged, when something is given and received in return. Okay, so keeping that in mind, again, if you need to look down at those as we read through, make sure you take advantage of those footnotes. All right, we're going to go ahead and start on page 134. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely, which means in large amounts, and the grass was richly green. The people of the village began to gather in the square, between the post office and the bank, around 10 o'clock. In some towns there were so many people that the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 26th, but in this village, where there were only about 300 people, the whole lottery took less than 2 hours. So it could begin at 10 o'clock in the morning and still be through in time to allow the villagers to get home for noon dinner. The children assembled first, of course. School was recently over for the summer, and the feeling of liberty sat uneasily on most of them. They tended to gather together quietly for a while before they broke into boisterous or loud or rowdy play, and their talk was still of the classroom and the teacher, of books and reprimands. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and the other boys soon followed his example, selecting the smoothest and roundest stones. Bobby and Henry Jones and Dickie Delacroix, the villagers pronounced his name Delacroix, eventually made a great pile of stones in one corner of the square, and guarded against the raids of the other boys. The girls stood aside, talking among themselves, looking over their shoulders at the boys, and the very small children rolled in the dust or clung to the hands of their older brothers and sisters. Okay, we're at paragraph 3 now. Soon the men began to gather, surveying their own children. Speaking of planting and rain, tractors and taxes. They stood together away from the pile of stones in the corner, and their jokes were quiet, and they smiled rather than laughed. The women, wearing faded house dresses and sweaters, came shortly after their menfolk. They greeted one another and exchanged bits of gossip as they went to join their husbands. Soon the women, standing by their husbands, began to call to their children, and the children came reluctantly, having to be called 4 or 5 times. Bobby Martin ducked under his mother's grasping hand and ran, laughing, back to the pile of stones. His father spoke up sharply, and Bobby came quickly and took his place between his father and his oldest brother. Okay. Paragraph 4, we should be on page 136. The lottery was conducted, as were the square dances, the teenage club, the Halloween program, by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. Now, devote means to give all their attention or time. He was a round-faced, jovial man, and he ran the coal business, and people were sorry for him because he had no children, and his wife was a scold. When he arrived in the square carrying the black wooden box, there was a murmur of conversation among the villagers, and he waved and called, "Little late today, folks." The postmaster, Mr. Graves, followed him, carrying a three-legged stool, and the stool was put in the corner of the square, and Mr. Summers set the black box down on it. The villagers kept their distance, leaving a space between themselves and the stool, and when Mr. Summers said, "Some of you fellows want to give me a hand?" there was a hesitation before two men, Mr. Martin and his oldest son Baxter, came forward to hold the box steady on the stool, while Mr. Summers stirred up the papers inside it. Okay, paragraph 5. The original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago, and the black box now resting on the stool had been put into use even before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in the town, was born. Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. There was a story that the present box had been made with some pieces of the box that had preceded it, the one that had been constructed when the first people settled down to make a village here. Every year after the lottery, Mr. Summers began talking again about a new box, but every year the subject was allowed to fade off without anything's being done. The black box grew shabbier each year. By now it was no longer completely black, but splintered badly along one side to show the original wood color, and in some places faded or stayed. Paragraph 6. Mr. Martin and his oldest son Baxter held the black box securely on the stool until Mr. Summers had stirred the papers thoroughly, which means very carefully and completely, with his hand. Because so much of the ritual had been forgotten or discarded, Mr. Summers had been successful in having slips of paper substituted for the chips of wood that had been used for generations. Chips of wood, Mr. Summers had argued, had been all very well when the village was tiny, but now that the population was more than 300 and likely to keep growing, it was necessary to use something that would fit more easily into the black box. The night before the lottery, Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves made up the slips of paper and put them in the box, and it was then taken to the safe of Mr. Summers' coal company and locked up until Mr. Summers was ready to take it to the square next morning. The rest of the year the box was put away, sometimes one place, sometimes another. It had spent 1 year in Mr. Graves' barn and another year underfoot in the post office, and sometimes it was set on a shelf in the Martin grocery and left there. Okay, students, we're going to stop. This is the first part. Now, what I want you to kind of do is we're going to think about what has happened in this first part. So a couple of things kind of popped out at me as I was reading the book, or reading the first part of the story. You know, they talked a lot about some stones. And I'm trying to think, like, why is that important in this part of the story, the lottery? Another thing that I was kind of thinking about, and I don't know, what do you think? This black box that they're using, does that tell us something? You know, it's very old. It doesn't look like it's in very good shape anymore. They kind of don't take really good care of it. They kind of don't keep it in the same place. So I kind of wonder what is the meaning of this old tattered box in this piece of the lottery. Okay, so as we move on, I want you to think about what has happened in the first part. And again, this kind of helps determine, do you know what the literary elements are? So we know the townspeople have gathered together for a lottery. What do the townspeople think about this lottery? So thinking about how they've gathered, their body language, just kind of how they've situated themselves in the group. Is that telling you something about what this event is like for them? So the last thing I'm going to ask you to do is think, if I asked you today, what is the setting? Could you answer that or find that? How about the characters? What's the plot? Is there any problem so far? And do you know what the theme is? Now, we have identified some of those if you look back on page 132. You might be able to answer those if you're not really sure. Now today, I'm not going to give you an assignment. I don't want you working on any of the worksheet pages because we're going to do them in sections. We're going to do 3 sections. So today, I would just say take time to catch up on any assignments that you might have not completed yet. If you haven't done some software, make sure you get that done. Again, we're looking at 2 20-minute software sessions each week. And if you have not gotten your reading and reading log in, remember every day you should be reading 15 minutes. So at the end of the week, if it's a 5-day week, you're going to have to make sure you have tallied up those 75 minutes. So again, if you're behind on anything, take advantage. If you just need something to do, go ahead and do some software and see if you can improve your scores in the area of reading and vocabulary. So that is it for today. Again, if you have any questions about work that you're missing, make sure you get a hold of me and I will answer as promptly as I can. And we'll sign off for today. Have a good day, and I miss you guys. Bye.